are you ready for an old test tonight? Say, he doesn't give little ones. Well, you know, I'm halfway joking, but I'm also partially serious. I've had several people ask me, and it just so happened to coincide with some of my own thinking about some tests. So let me say a few things about that, because we're not going to do it tonight, but we are going to do that very soon. If we're spending the time to study these things, and I would hope that the important things that we study will stay with us. There'd be really no sense in being here. Not all of the details, but the important things to stay with us. I do foresee in the not that distant future that we're going to be into theology. And you're going to really appreciate theology is very difficult. There's a lot to comprehend and a lot to contemplate as well. Surely we're not after, as our end goal, academic excellence. We're after spiritual growth. But it does involve knowledge of the Word of God and knowledge of spiritual matters and knowledge of things that might relate to that. And I think it'd be of an immense benefit and blessing to, be prepared to really be able to think and to work our way through some of those things. I don't know exactly when we'll get to that, although I have my idea. So these little tests that we're going to do in various classes are purely voluntary. Purely voluntary. I'll never see it. I'll have maybe a list of questions with me, and if you want to, and you're up to date with your notes in that section, like when we end Samaritanism, which will only be, 6 or 7 messages total, then before we go into a new section, I think that I'll just maybe ask you a few questions, and it's purely voluntary. You don't have to take it if you don't want to. But I think some of you would like to do that. You'd like to have studied your notes and see, well, how can I do? Do I remember? Did I comprehend the things that were important? And the test will be extremely easy. And maybe some of you would want really difficult ones. But they're just going to cover what is essential about that matter. Not all of the things that could be asked about it. But what's the important chapter in the Old Testament concerning, quote, Samaritanism, unquote, 2 Kings 17. Just so you'll be familiar with major general things like that. We won't ask you for the dates of Ashurbanipal or Esarhaddon or anything like that. Things that will help you to make sure that you basically understood what Samaritanism is about. Okay? Or in other things that we're studying. I think that we're going to probably do that real soon. And whenever a teacher does this, he's supposed to make some type of statement like this, that to do this makes it more difficult for me, and I think that's supposed to somehow elicit sympathy from you and then make you think, well, if it's more difficult for him, at least I ought to do something about it too. Well, I'm not going to say that, because it is more difficult for me, but you don't have to do it if you don't want to. But I think whenever we finish small sections, then I'll ask some questions, and it'll be closed book if you want to take it. Be no sense in reading your notes to find the answer, and maybe we can do it in 10 or 15 minutes and then go on. And you can look over your notes at home or the test at home and see how you did on that. Okay? I don't think that will present any problems, because no one's required to do it. So that shouldn't present any problems. If you don't want to, you don't have to. You can just sit and listen and see if you can still respond mentally, respond in your mind to the question to come up with the right answer. But I don't want to be stuck with grading papers or anything like that. I don't want to turn it into something like that. That just becomes a little too difficult, because the test can get rather long and rather time-consuming. But I just think, I know I would appreciate that. Maybe I'm a little bit different than you are, but then maybe again I'm not. But I know I would appreciate that. I'd like, after 5 or 6 messages, I'd like my medal to be tested. See now, well, did I get everything, or did I get what was important? I mean, important things, the big things, not the little small details, the important things. You kind of understand Samaritanism, the history of it, better now than you did before. Well, then you'll be able to find out. Now, what we are doing in Samaritanism, if you'll turn over to the New Testament, I know I've alluded to these passages several times. Acts chapter 1 and verse 8, but I just want you to look at it here in this context. We are asking ourselves just who are the Samaritan people? And I'm going to finish up tonight with a little more reconstruction of their development, specifically, after I say some introductory things, their development in the period between the Testaments, which we haven't gotten to yet. But in Acts 1:8, in light of that, Christians are just so familiar with the name Samaritan and with what they think is the correct idea of their history, and basically it's a correct idea, maybe a little anachronistic in some areas. Therefore, they just read over Acts 1:8. They don't really ask themselves, what is being said? Obviously, we've got three visions here. A witness of the church to the Jewish people. You'll receive power, and the Holy Spirit has come upon you. You shall be witnesses unto me in Jerusalem and Judea. A witness unto the Samaritan people. A witness unto the Gentiles. And this isn't the only place in Jesus' teaching where you find this. There is something that is distinct about the Samaritan people. They can't be called Jews with a whole breath, no pause, no commas, no parenthesis, no clarification. In the same manner, they can't be called Gentiles either. And we're seeing kind of why. There are different things about them. They are a unique people. And over in Matthew 10, I think we find this again. Now, it's a rather negative reference, Matthew 10, verses 5 and 6. But we still find them in this halfway place, as we do there in Acts 1:8. So that's why I'm trying to give you a little of the background, historically, of these people, how we see them developing in history, where the narrative of their history touches home with the narrative of the Jewish people, our Old Testament, and so forth. These 12 Jesus sent forth and commanded them, saying, Go not into the way of the Gentiles, and into any city of the Samaritans enter ye not. Notice how he distinguishes between the two? But go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Now, it took 2 verses to say what was said in one, Acts 1 and verse 8. You've got 3 different groups of people here, though. Christians too often have looked down too much, I think, on the Samaritan people and not realized that although they were not counted to be Jewish people by Jesus or by the early church, they still had a place that was somewhat higher than the Gentiles had. And it was because of their association. They are Jews. I can't really say their association with the Jews, but then again, in a sense, they're not Jews. So I'll say their association with the Jewish people and with the Old Testament covenant. Now, last Friday night, we had rounded out a discussion, a reconstruction of their development from 2 Kings 17. That was the basic passage that we looked at. And I want to come back and say a few things about that before moving on. We see that 2 Kings 17 is the important chapter in all of the Bible for the people that become the Samaritans. I don't want to have to keep saying for the people that become. If I say for the Samaritans, we ought to know enough by now that we don't read New Testament into 2 Kings 17. So we would just speak like a redactor. We say Samaritan, and then you put that in parenthesis or quotation marks or however, and deal with it yourself in your own mind. It's an important chapter because of the fall of the northern kingdom, importation, deportation procedures of the Assyrian overlords, and the return of the teaching priest in 722 or shortly thereafter BC. Now, it could be argued that the remaining Israelites, remember only some go into captivity and most of the people are left behind, that the remaining Israelites as well as the returning priest might be just as syncretistic as the imported pagans become. Remember, the pagans are the ones who are painted as the syncretists there. They're the ones who come in, they worship foreign gods, they know not the God of the land of Israel, and therefore the Lord, Yahweh, sends lions in their midst. And through that, the teaching priest is brought back to teach them the law of God and the law of Moses so that they can learn the law of the Lord and these lions will be taken away. And so some people, I think, would try to argue that, well, the Israelite people themselves are the ones who are syncretistic at this point. Perhaps they would even go so far as to say the returning priest himself is syncretistic. And they would say this only stands to reason because of the fact that Israel all along was apostate anyway. I mean, all throughout the Old Testament, it's not as though she were a pure people, religiously speaking, by the stretch of anyone's imagination. She was apostate all along. So how could orthodoxy ever begin with no one to lead the way? Both the pagans and the northern people, the Israelites, are corrupt. Well, of course, I don't think that's the way to read the history there. If you've got a returning priest, he's coming back to teach them the true ways. Now, he might be deficient in his view, but still he's coming back to teach them the way of Moses and the way of God. I think that it would be better to see, as I argued last time, that the pagans are the ones who are the syncretists, and we really don't have any syncretism, as we understand it. We really don't have any syncretism involved in the northern community. Not among the people who are doing anything for God. Now, obviously, you can have some agnostics or some atheists or some pagan Israelites up there. We're only talking about whomever, and we don't know how many or where they were or what their names were, but the people who were more or less pure in their religion. Now, I gave you verses last time in 2 Chronicles as well as the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah 41:5 was a rather important text that show us that there were faithful people in northern Israel long after the fall of the kingdom. Remember, I gave you verses for religious reforms under Hezekiah and Josiah. They sent letters to northern tribes. Now, we read in one of those passages in 2 Chronicles that the people up there mocked the messengers sent by the southern king. But in a few places, however, even with that being there, we read that people did respond and they returned down to Jerusalem to come to one of the feasts. Now, what makes Jeremiah 41:5 unique, though, from any of the other passages that I might could give you, such as those in 2 Chronicles 30 and 34, is the fact that we are 100+ years removed from the fall of the northern kingdom. Moreover, the southern kingdom has fallen as well, and you still have people from the north coming down to worship in Jerusalem. Jeremiah 41:5. I think I'll read that again. It's such an important passage. Not just for Samaritanism. See, I'm using this just to show you something about the state of the northern kingdom, or what remains of it. But it's just an important text for Old Testament history, lest we get in our mind that whenever the Assyrians came in, they so wiped out the nation and destroyed the inhabitants that nothing left. Nothing was left at all. And that's simply not true to history. Jeremiah 41:5. There came certain from Shechem, Shiloh, and Samaria. The three S's. Of all places, Shechem and Samaria are mentioned here. 80 men, having their beards shaven and their clothes rent, and having cut themselves with offerings and incense in their hand to bring them to the house of the Lord. And along with this, you may want to note, and just for your notes, don't turn to it, Ezra 2:68. Now, I would put these along with Jeremiah 41:5, but they're not as clear as Jeremiah 41:5. Ezra 2:68 and Ezra 3:8. But here we've got people from the north who return. So I think that it's actually better to go way back to the days of the formal division of the kingdom in 931 B.C., where Rehoboam, son of Solomon, becomes king of Judah. Jeroboam becomes king of the northern kingdom, Israel. And remember what Jeroboam did? He instituted so-called calf worship. Really bulls. 2 bulls were set up. One in Dan, one in Bethel. And I think that it's best to see these bulls of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, and you go through the book of Kings, and that repetitive refrain there is always, and he sinned after the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin. Over and over and over. The sins of Jeroboam that made Israel to sin. The sins of Jeroboam that made Israel to sin. That's a repetitive refrain that goes over and over and over in the book of Kings. Now, although they're certainly abominable, I don't think that in the minds of either Jeroboam or of the people of the northern kingdom that what we have on our hands is syncretism or idolatry. Now, hear what I just said. In their minds, I mean, it's sin, however you want to paint it, to have bulls as your representation of God. But having bulls as your representation of God is not exactly the same as having bulls as your God. So rather than being syncretistic or idolatrous in their mind, I think what we should see here, as someone else has called it, is innovative Yahwehism. Just a fancy term for sin, I guess. Innovative Yahwehism. A new way of worshiping Yahweh. Why do you think that would even be necessary or thought of by the Northern Kingdom? I think there was a reason behind it. Well, what about this? Jeroboam, it's a political move. Jeroboam recognizes that Jerusalem, even for the apostate Northern Kingdom, is the center of the nation. Everything is there. The newly constructed temple, the paint is hardly dry, as it were. Everything is there. And that was where David established everything, the great king, who had only been king 2 kings earlier. He has to find a way to keep the people of the Northern Kingdom in Israel, to keep them from going down to Judah and Jerusalem. And, of course, what he could do is build a whole new temple, but, that's rather difficult to do. And so what he does in the place of that, to keep the people in the north, I would argue, is that he invented this so-called innovative form of Yahwehism, a new way of worshiping the same God that the southern kingdom worshiped. Of course, it was under the figure of images, and that was forbidden strictly in the Ten Commandments, Exodus chapter 20, Deuteronomy chapter 5.
Aren't the Ten Commandments so clear about that? How can you ever reduce the people into telling you?
Well, they did back in the days of the book of Exodus. That was right after the giving of the Ten Commandments there. And we probably can't exactly appreciate in our day and culture, because we're so far away from dependence on nature for, almost anything. We can hardly appreciate ancient religion, ancient society, where everything depended on nature. And so you worship through the form of something that had to do with nature. A bull would obviously represent strength and fertility, as would a lot of other forms. But in Exodus 32, we're barely removed by 12 chapters from the giving of the Ten Commandments. And what do we have there but bull worship, calf worship? These are the gods that brought you forth out of the land of Egypt. Again, I don't think that Aaron intended, that Aaron, the high priest, thought that this is God. Surely not. See, I think a lot of just, as you read the Bible, you sometimes read something into it that isn't there. Aaron thought this is God. Surely not. Aaron knew that wasn't God. We're worshiping God above through this image here. Man is incurably religious. There's no doubt about that. But man also has a problem with the invisible. He always wants to localize it, localize God and make him visible. And so we've had the problem with images in the Western Church and icons in the Eastern Church for hundreds and hundreds of years. And we even have it in Protestantism. Okay, so let's come down then a little further in our history to the times of Zerubbabel, Ezra, Nehemiah. Now I said we're going to look at their history in the period between the Testaments, but we have to really start just at the very beginning of this era, really at the close of the earlier one, the post-exilic community. Zerubbabel, Ezra, Nehemiah. Now for this, we need to turn back to a verse we also looked at last time. That was Ezra chapter 4, first couple of verses. Ezra chapter 4. We can go all the way down to verse 6. 1 through 6. During this period now, the Samaritans are never called Samaritans. They're never called Samaritans in the biblical record. That term never appears in the Old Testament, except in 2 Kings 17, and there it's a geographical reference, so it's still not the type of reference that we find over in the New Testament, these Samaritan people. But what are they called here? Adversaries. Adversaries of Judah and Benjamin. 2 southern tribes, by the way. But probably, again, what we've got to see here is adversaries now that Ezra is looking back, writing the account. Adversaries with some adversarial role prior to Ezra's book being opened or written, I don't think so. So watch as we go along. Now, when the adversaries, he's writing past tense, looking back, yes, they did become that, adversaries. They weren't at the time. Now, when the adversaries of Judah and Benjamin heard that the children of the captivity builded the temple unto the Lord God of Israel, they came to Zerubbabel and to the chief of the fathers, and said unto them, Let us build with you, for we seek your God as ye do. And we do sacrifice unto him. See, they had lost their temple. Both kingdoms had lost the temple, but they had never given up sacrifice. Which, you see, means they had to have an altar, a sacred altar, somewhere. Some people believe that it was in Jerusalem, that the people from the north came down, but I don't think you have any proof of that. It would probably stand to reason it would be in the north. Let us build with you, for we seek your God as ye do. We do sacrifice unto him since the days of Esarhaddon, king of Ashur, which brought us up hither. But Zerubbabel and Joshua and the rest of the chief of the fathers of Israel said unto them, Ye have nothing to do with us, to build an house to our God, but we ourselves together will build unto the Lord God of Israel. Well, what I would say, and then I'm not reading the end of that verse, I'll get to that here in a moment, is that we must be careful not to read into this a supposed earlier enmity. Now, surely, since the division of the kingdom, or really since the days of Joshua and Judges, as we've seen earlier, there's always been some political tension between people from the north and people of the south. But I mean this full-blown sense of the Jews hate the Samaritans and the Samaritans hate the Jews. There's no love lost in their relationship. Must be careful not to read this term adversary in 4:1 as though they were adversaries earlier. They are counted as adversaries at this time, and I'll say why here in a moment. And then because they are counted as adversaries, they act like adversaries, as we will see when we finish reading these first 6 verses. Now that's important what I just said. They are counted as adversaries by the post-exilic returning community, Zerubbabel as the head of it. They're counted as adversaries, and then they fulfill their role. They, in fact, do become adversaries. The adversarial position, I would say, in other words, begins at this point. Because the Samaritans, as we have shown you last time, basically had the same form of religion as the Jews. And I think verse 2 spells that out right in the center of it. Let us build with you. We seek your God as ye do. Zerubbabel didn't say, no, you don't. That would have been the easiest rebuttal if, in fact, they didn't. It's just say, no, you don't. It can be proven because look at all you're involved in up there. He never says that. That must not be an issue then. From what I understand, Ezra 4:2, right in the center of it, it's a true statement from the, let's call them Samaritan, from the Samaritan people. Let us build with you, for we seek God as ye do. We're not seeking God in some other way. We seek God as ye do. So why do we have Zerubbabel's abrupt statement to them here in verse 3 then? If, as I'm saying, arguing verse 2 is true, we seek God as ye do, why do we have Zerubbabel's repudiation of them? You see, what I think we're going to end up with here is the rivalry is caused by the Jews, not by the Samaritans. And it's all within the will and plan of God, but it's caused by the Jews. It's caused by Zerubbabel's attitude. He says, ye have nothing to do with us to build an house unto our God. We ourselves together will build unto the Lord God of Israel. Why? Well, I think the end of verse 3, the very end of it, it is a political problem. Zerubbabel had been given direct permission by the king of Persia to build the temple. And he may have felt that legally this precluded anyone else being involved. Reading the end of verse 3, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, hath commanded us. See, he has been given permission, as you read the first chapter of Ezra, to do this. And you just don't go inviting other peoples. You see, the Assyrians, the Persians knew these were two kingdoms, a northern kingdom that fell at one time and a southern that fell at another. You don't just go invite other nations to start helping you, people from another kingdom. What does that look like in the eyes of the king back home? Now, we know how the Samaritan people misconstrue the evidence, and it ends up looking the same thing anyway, but that doesn't go over very well. Besides, you've got all of this history behind these people, their relationship. I mean, the Samaritans probably don't want to see a revival of the South. That is, the South independent from the North. Because Jerusalem will become what? It'll become the established center again. And so we've got these rivalries that go all the way back to Solomon's days and then some. And it may actually strip some of the power away from the northern kingdom by the creation of a new state here. So you've got all types of political problems that we have to see here. Zerubbabel's coming back to establish religion and to establish the state. It's under the domination still of the Persian government, because Zerubbabel is just sent as a viceroy, as it were, as a governor of the land. But it's a new state there, the restoration of the southern kingdom. So the people from the north don't want to see this. Why? Because of the ancient rivalries that go back many, many hundreds of years. Jerusalem will become the center of the land again, whether you're talking about the north or the south. The temple is going to be built there. You see, if they can have a hand in building the temple, then maybe they can have a hand in controlling the events there. Because after all, they've been here longer. These are returning exiles. The adversaries are people who've been in the land for a long period of time and who've come down from the north, troubling the people in the south now. Let's finish the passage then. The people of the land weaken the hands of the people of Judah and trouble them in building. Notice they're given so many different names, and they're not technical names. They're just called the adversaries of Judah and Benjamin, the people of the land. You don't ever find Samaritan here, but that's who these people will become. The people of the land weaken the hands. They hired counselors against them to frustrate their purpose all the days of Cyrus, king of Persia, even until the reign of Darius, king of Persia. And in the reign of Ahasuerus, in the beginning of his reign, wrote they unto him an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem. And I'm sure you're familiar with the books here. They're saying, well, see, they're going to build this old rebellious city, which of old times has been a thorn in the side of ancient kings and kingdoms. And, well, you see, Cyrus had just given permission for them to do that. But whenever you get letters back, and they're so negative in their tone, well, then maybe the law of the Persians isn't so good after all. So you see, the Jews, I think, are in a no-win situation either way they go here. And it takes some strong leadership. This is the whole story of the post-exilic books here, of Haggai and Zechariah leading Ezra and Nehemiah to go ahead and get the work done anyway. Because the Jews are in a no-win situation. They can't allow these people, the people of the land, to help them. That won't look good back to the king of Persia. You have enlisted the help of another nation. And they can't do it on their own, because if they don't invite the people of the land to help them, they'll report nasty letters back to the king of Persia that they're rebuilding this rebellious city. So the Jews are in a no-win situation. So here, in essence, is what we have at the very beginning, because Zerubbabel is the earliest of the three, Zerubbabel, Ezra, Nehemiah, of the post-exilic community. And then if you jump over into Nehemiah's book, about 100 years later, the same thing is true again. Nehemiah 2:10. So see, I'm saying that Zerubbabel is really the one who starts the bitter form of rivalry. I'm not accusing him. I'm just saying his response to the people in verse 3 of Ezra 4 is really what starts it all. He declines their offer to help build the temple. And he has his reasons why. I mean, this is a very, very difficult time. Just don't assume that you know everything about this from what I'm saying just about Samaritanism. We're peeking into this time in Israel's history from one small point of view, Samaritanism. You've got to really be familiar with these four post-exilic books, or really five if you throw Malachi in, but especially Ezra, Nehemiah, Haggai, and Zechariah, to really understand the political situation. It's very difficult. The time is, and the circumstances may have dictated perhaps extreme Jewish measures. Maybe Zerubbabel was a little extreme in denying any help. But that can be understood because of the difficulty of the times. So Nehemiah 2:10 is many years later, and we're going to find same situation. It's just becoming more developed. That's what I want you to see now in the period between the Testaments. Remember, the rivalry goes way back, as far as we know, back into Israel's history whenever they come into the Promised Land. As soon as they get it divided up, when you've got larger tribes, smaller tribes, more populous ones, less populous ones, better places in Israel, worse places, obviously you have rivalry, you have jealousy, you have bitterness. And that just begins to develop. The kingdom is split, 931. It begins to develop. The northern kingdom falls. The southern kingdom falls. More development. They're both back in their land now. More development. And it grows more and more and more pronounced as we go through the period between the Testaments. That is really the key to Samaritanism as we see it in the New Testament. We would really be at a loss to understand all of what the New Testament means if we closed the Old and opened up the New and had nothing to read meanwhile. By the way, this is ITP, is it not? And that's what's important. Samaritanism during the intertestamental period.
For the
By the way, this is ITP, is it not? And that's what's important. Samaritanism during the intertestamental period. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the servant, the Ammonite, heard of it, it grieved them exceedingly that there was come a man to seek the welfare of the children of Israel. Now, there Israel means Judah. It's just used in a general sense to mean the true nation, not the northern kingdom, because Sanballat represents the people from the north. Nehemiah 2:10. Now, who was Sanballat? Well, he was governor of Samaria. Under the Persians, he was governor of Samaria. Persians are the leaders of that part of the world of this day. And he would obviously not relish a new neighboring nation with a new Persian-appointed governor, which is exactly what Nehemiah was, because this would infringe on territory over which he had himself earlier been placed. I mean, what we have in effect, think of it like this. With the exiles over in captivity, they have just gone through the southern kingdom, the horrors of the Babylonian siege. The northern kingdom had already gone through that 100 years earlier and had basically become rather stabilized after that. You've got the exiles over in Babylonian community. You've got the northern kingdom controlling Israel. The best of the people are taken by the Babylonians over to Babylon. So in other words, now it's kind of a reversal of the 931 division of the kingdom. Now you've got one kingdom again, but it's a northern kingdom only. So what happens with the decree of the Persians to allow Zerubbabel, Ezra, and Nehemiah to go back? You're dividing the kingdom again. That's the way you could see it. Maybe you'll better understand it. You have one kingdom, it splits at Solomon's death, it's reunited, the fall of the southern kingdom, it's split with the returning exilic community. And that's what's causing all the problems here. Sanballat had been governor of Samaria, but I'm sure his territory was a rather large territory. And he's not going to relish the thought of a new neighboring nation, and especially one that was an adversary of theirs earlier, Judah, to arise, over which a new Persian-appointed governor will reign, Nehemiah. That would infringe on his own territory, on his own government. So all of these continued rebuttals by the Jews just stirred the fires even more. And there's no love lost. The people of the north, or the remaining people, or the people of the land, become just as hate-filled toward the Jews as the Jews do toward them. But you can read this in other places in Nehemiah. For instance, over in Nehemiah 13, now this is the last chapter, in verse 28, near the very end of the book. This is a very interesting verse. I'll tell you what happens. You can read it as I'm telling you. Nehemiah Now he's been it's been 12 years since he's been here, I believe. You read this earlier in the chapter. And he's back in Jerusalem after a 12-year period. And he's discovered that the high priest's grandson has married a daughter of Sanballat. And so he tells us that he actually chases him right out of the city. It's a very difficult time and circumstances. Look at verse 28. One of the sons of Joiada, the son of Eliashib, who was the high priest. So a grandson of the high priest was son-in-law. That means he married a daughter of Sanballat, the Horonite, the one we just read about in Nehemiah 2:10. Nehemiah says, therefore I chased him from me. So he chased him out of the city, reigning back north. Because look what's trying to take place here. Again, the northern kingdom's trying to get a foothold in true worship down here in the south, in the true place of worship, by marrying into the line of the high priesthood. So you've got another very interesting verse in Nehemiah 13:28. Okay, that should sum up what I wanted to say about Zerubbabel, Ezra, Nehemiah, those periods. Just trying to show you how the tension is on the rise. Now let's move on and talk about something that you won't find in the Old Testament. The rest of what I've got to say tonight you won't find in the Bible. You have to go to other sources for this, and you truly get into the intertestamental period. And that concerns the temple on Mount Gerizim. We've often alluded to that. I want to give you a few more details concerning that. The temple on Mount Gerizim. Now, from what we've seen in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, the people of the north are going to be allowed no hand at all in official worship and liturgy in the south. In other words, they're going to be excluded from the temple. They can see that. So it only stands to reason they've got to do something about that. They're faced with a very important religious dilemma. So, during the reign of Darius III, around 333 BC, a little of this material, by the way, is sketchy. We're basically dependent on Josephus for this. A temple was built by the Samaritans on Mount Gerizim, sometimes pronounced Gerizim. Now let me sum up what Josephus has. I didn't even take a reference down. I'm sorry about that, but I'll just sum it up for you. This is what Josephus tells us about this very important event, the building of the temple of the north. I mean, that completely separates the people then. You've got a southern temple, a northern temple, two entirely different groups from here on out. Here's what Josephus said. Just get down whatever you can. Darius sent a man named Sanballat to Samaria to be governor. Now we're going to talk about that Sanballat versus the one of Nehemiah, or are they the same, here in a moment. So just don't assume that they are until we get through. Darius sent a man named Sanballat to Samaria to be governor, and Sanballat gave his daughter in marriage to the high priest's brother, whose name was Manasseh. Sanballat gave his daughter in marriage to the high priest's, of course that'd be the Jewish high priest's brother, whose name was Manasseh. See, on any test that I give you, I wouldn't ask you to give me all these details from Josephus. It gets a little complicated. The Jewish authorities, I'm just summing up a lot of it. Josephus has a long account of this. The Jewish authorities demand this breakup. They demanded that they break up, maybe I should say. That is, the daughter of Sanballat and Manasseh. But Sanballat promised Manasseh that if he would stay married to his daughter, then he would bring him to the north and make him high priest over the Samaritans. Okay, you got that so far? You see, the Jewish people don't like this, rightly so. We see Nehemiah's response in Nehemiah 13:28 of the marriage of the daughter of this man named Sanballat to some type of relation to the high priest, there in Nehemiah 13:28, the grandson. Here it's a brother of the high priest whose name was Manasseh. So the Jewish authorities demand that they break up, but Sanballat promises Manasseh that if he stays with his daughter, he'll make him high priest over the Samaritans. So what happens? Well, Manasseh decides to stay with Sanballat's daughter in marriage. He defects from the south, goes to the north, and Josephus said a number of Jews defected to their side with him. And then, of course, at this time, the date 333 B.C., we're right at the conclusion to the Medo-Persian Empire. And the Greeks, of course, follow. So the next thing that happens, Josephus said, is that Manasseh receives permission from Alexander the Great to build a temple on Mount Gerizim. So see, here's how we get to the temple, which they quickly proceeded to do. Now, the reason Alexander allowed that is he liked the idea of having the Jews split up into perfectly religious rival groups. So you've got temples in both. That will certainly completely, totally alienate the people from one another. And we see that's true by the New Testament times. The people of the south stay with theirs, the people of the north stay with their holy mountain, which is all they have left of their temple. So Alexander the Great gives Manasseh and Sanballat the right to build a temple on Gerizim, which they quickly do. All of this is accomplished somewhere around 321 B.C. Now, if you look back over the details of that story I just gave you, they read very similar to Nehemiah 13:28. And yet we don't have anyone named Manasseh. That's a different person. We are with Nehemiah quite a bit earlier. So it's often been asked, how can we, and we've got so many similarities. We've got the name Sanballat, we've got Jewish high priests, we've got marriages involved with people from the north and the Jewish high priest or relation of his in the south. And so it's often asked, do we have two accounts or only one, with the other one being somehow embellished or false or whatever? Some people, the critical scholars, say, for some reason, they always want to say that extra-biblical sources are reliable and that biblical ones are not. So, of course, Josephus is right, and pseudo-Nehemiah, whoever this man is wrong. He's got all of his dates confused. Well, we believe in the inspiration of Scripture, so Nehemiah is right. Josephus is not inspired. Sometimes he's right, sometimes he's not. So then another alternative would be, well, perhaps Josephus is the one that's wrong. That he was reading back earlier in his history. Nehemiah is living during this time. He ought to know what's happening. Josephus is looking back 4 centuries earlier. So Josephus is the one who has his dates and a few of his facts confused here. That's possible, by the way. It's not possible that Nehemiah is wrong. It is possible that Josephus is wrong. But there's a third alternative. And that is we've got two separate accounts that are not related to one another. But you see, because of their extreme similarity, we have an unusual circumstance to have two accounts separated by 100 years that are so similar. Two people named Sanballat, both governors of the north, Samaria, both who married their daughter to someone who's related to the Jewish high priest in the south. Extreme similarity. Well, I'll just leave you concerning that issue. I don't think that it can be finally answered, whether Josephus is confused or, in fact, we have two separate events. But there were some archaeological discoveries in 1962 and 1963 north of Jericho, which have proven the existence of two separate Sanballats separated by about 100 years. One during the 5th century, one during the 4th century, the time that we would need to fit both of these accounts. So in other words, what I'm saying is, it is possible that Josephus could be telling us a totally unrelated story that happened 100 years after Nehemiah's account. 2 Sanballats, 2 marriages, extreme similarity, no question about that, but it is possible. Okay, and then let me give you one final thing, and this concerns the revolt of Samaria under the Greeks and the destruction of their temple. So for fresh material tonight that just concerned ITP, I've really given you 3 things if you wanted the headings. Number 1 would be the post-exilic community, Zerubbabel, Ezra, Nehemiah. Number 2 would be the building of the Gerizim temple. And number 3 would be its destruction and Samaria's revolt, or reverse that, Samaria's revolt and its destruction. Okay, Samaria revolts under Alexander the Great, the end of the 4th century BC. As a matter of fact, they revolt prior to their temple being built. I have to go back a little earlier to get this history in. Alexander comes into the land of Israel. He captures Samaria. Now I'm talking about the city, by the way, now. He captures Samaria. He settles it with Macedonians. That's his homeland anyway. And the Samaritans are thrown out. Where did they go? Well, logically, they chose Shechem as their new capital, which had been of ancient religious importance to them anyway, remember, the city of Shechem. So they choose Shechem as their new capital. And I think that this return to the ancient city was probably just another step in the solidification of their new identity. They're going back to an ancient city of theirs, the city between the mountains of Gerizim and Ebal, that is old Shechem. Now during the Greek period, remember, we have the struggles between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. Well, we know kind of what happens down in the south. So many of the Jews just fall head over heels in love with the pagan views of the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, just who's ever in control. You got a small minority of the people that become guerrilla fighters, some of them known as the Maccabees, as well as other people related to them. So what do the Samaritans do whenever you've got all of these discussions and all of these wars between Ptolemies and the Seleucids? Well, the Samaritans use the opportunity to just bend with the flow so they can escape all persecution. You may want to note here ITP tape number 40. Some of the Jews are resisting Greek paganism to the death. The Samaritans used opportunism to escape all persecution, and the Jews never forgot this and never forgave them. So although the city of Samaria has revolted under Alexander in 331, around that date, 331 BC, he still allows them to build the temple, which is built on Gerizim about 10 years later, 321 BC. And it stands for about 200 years, almost exactly. It's a fairly easy figure to keep in your mind. How long does the Temple of Gerizim last? 2 centuries, almost exactly. 200 years the Samaritan temple lasts. And I'm just describing to you now what brings its downfall, because the Samaritans used opportunism in the wars between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids to escape all persecution, and some of the Jews suffered by death to maintain the ways of God. And the Jews never forgot this and never forgave the northern kingdom for being so fickle in their faith whenever the chips were down. So whenever the Jews finally overthrew the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, as we've discussed before, and they had a period of about 100 years of independence between the Ptolemy Seleucid time and the period of the Romans coming in. Whenever the Jews finally gained their independence, then, under their leader, John Hyrcanus, they decide to end all rivalry with that northern form of worship. So, 20 years, Well, let me give you the date. First of all, the destruction of the temple is about 128 B.C. 20 years later, they destroy the cities of Samaria and Shechem. The Jewish people, under John Hyrcanus. You remember his name before? John Hyrcanus? We've talked about this a little before. I just threw it in that he was the one responsible for the destruction of the Samaritan temple. The temple is destroyed. It's built around 321. It's destroyed 128. Now you see, that's just 120 years prior to the time of Christ. So whenever you open up the Gospels and read about this tension between the people, it's new, it's recent. In that extreme form of having someone come in, your friends from the south, quote unquote, and they have annihilated your temple, your form of worship, your two important cities, Samaria, which has been rebuilt by this time, and your important capital of Shechem. That's why you've got this bitter rivalry in the New Testament. The thing that is more important than all the other events we've discussed so far is the destruction of the Samaritan temple by the Jewish people. Notice that so often it's the Jewish people who are causing the rivalry. They rebuff the Samaritans. We're not going to let you help us rebuild our temple. And so they go build their own. The Jews come in and destroy it. So often it's the Jews who are taking the initiative to present the problems between the two people. That's just the way that it was. So in 108 B.C., I said, Samaria and Shechem are destroyed. This brings a complete, total, irrevocable estrangement between the kingdom of the north and the kingdom of the south. This is the background for all the bitterness and hostility seen in the New Testament books. And this is what makes Philip's ministry so refreshing over in Acts chapter 8. And what makes Jesus' statements that we read earlier here tonight in Matthew 10 and Acts 1 so interesting, that he kept a place for the Samaritan people somewhere in between the Jews and the Gentiles. So we're talking about in the New Testament then a very bitter hatred. Remember the woman at the well? You Jews have no dealings with us who are Samaritans, and we have no dealings with you. Very bitter hatred. They avoided each other. They avoided even getting near each other, walking through each other's land. It springs from many different roots, you see, many roots. They go way back to the books of Joshua and Judges. That's what I've tried to emphasize through this study. They go way back that far. There are many different roots. There's one tree, a tree of bitterness and hatred. It's got many roots, though. And the primary one is the destruction of the Samaritan temple by the Jews under John Hyrcanus in 128 B.C. I'm going to close with some verses in the Apocrypha, book of Ecclesiasticus, chapter 50, verses 25 and 26. We discussed Ecclesiasticus. I said that these were some important verses that we would return to in our studies in the intertestamental period. Now, I have to give you a little of the background that you might not remember. Ecclesiasticus, according to the prologue, which is written by the grandson of the author of the book, is written in the middle of the 2nd century B.C. By the way, prior to both the book and the prologue, prior to the destruction of the temple, but only by a couple of years, especially the prologue, only by, 4 years. And the book itself, that would be, about 42 years. Now listen to what, and this is of course a Jewish book by a Jewish author, and listen to what he has to say. Famous verses in the Apocrypha for the Jewish-Samaritan rivalry in Ecclesiasticus 50, verses 25 and 26. 2 nations I detest, and a third is no nation at all. The inhabitants of Mount Seir, the Philistines, those would be the nations he detests. And what about that third one that is no nation at all? And the senseless folk that live up at Shechem. Now that's a bitter. You've laid them lower than the people of Mount Seir and the old pagan Philistines there. That's a low blow. 2 nations I detest, and a third is no nation at all. The inhabitants of Mount Seir the Philistines, two thorns in the side of Old Testament Israel, and the senseless folk that live at Shechem. And, of course, just a few years after, a couple of decades after this, the temple, you see, he's writing with the knowledge that here I am living wherever the writer of Ecclesiasticus lived, let's say either in Egypt or in Jerusalem or in Judea, and he knows there's a rival temple. It's already built. It's been in existence for over 100 years. There's a rival temple up there in Samaria on Mount Gerizim. And shortly thereafter, the time of the book of Ecclesiasticus, that temple is going to be destroyed by the Jewish people from the south. So those are some important, famous verses. I like the way they're said. It's good Jewish poetry anyway. You find that, in the Old Testament, like Proverbs, chapter 6, 6 things that the Lord hate, yea, 7 are an abomination. Book of Amos for, 3 evils, yea, for 4. 2 nations, yea, 3. 2 nations I detest, and the third is no nation at all. Mount Seir, the Philistines, and the senseless folk that live up at Shechem. Okay, so that's my conclusion to the history of the Samaritan people. Now, next time we're going to get into the question of their religious beliefs and practices, what we can discover in that area. We've touched on that a little bit, but we'll be a little more precise and organized. Just what were their religious beliefs and practices, so we can determine through that how they might differ from the Jewish people.